Also, um, I'm super excited to join you. I will um, share my screen. Before I jump in, I'll just say my accent is American. I was born in the US, but I now live in the UK, so you'll hear a random twang or two. So, I am going to first start with having you think about a time that you were excluded. And that could be currently feeling excluded in because you are a part of a minoritized group. It could be feeling excluded because you're first in your family to go to college and you're feeling maybe alienated. So think about a time you have felt excluded and see if anything that I share with you resonates today. Okay. Oops. I I need to do that and then so I also want to recognize that I sometimes speak quickly, so please don't hesitate to slow me down. So, inclusion. We are currently hearing this term a lot in a particular um, context. We are hearing it around diversity, equity, and inclusion. I am here to talk specifically about inclusion of survivors of human trafficking and modern slavery. I will not get into the definitions of those terms, as I'm sure you are all familiar, so I might be using those terms today interchangeably. I know there's complexity with that. But inclusion of survivors of human trafficking is can be understood in this context of diversity, equity, and inclusion. However, it has not been talked about in this way structurally in the sector. But I want you to think about inclusion within this group of three words. Typically, we hear it as DEI, DE, and I, and that these three words are meant to be separate. They're different, right? And I want to present a different way of thinking about it. I actually think instead of DEI, we go from IE to D. So we have inclusion, diversity, and then equity, and that in order in terms of systemic inclusion. And then I want to recommend that we move from inclusion to transformation, and I'll go into what that means in a little bit. I just realized full screen sharing is not allowing me to see my notes, so hang on a second. Here we go. Oh, that's okay. I am just going to... Apologies for that. Okay. So, inclusion, we really are thinking about inviting people who were excluded in the past. That's just the mere inviting people to something we're already doing. Diversity is really about ensuring that the new people that we're inviting are heterogeneous. So we're not just inviting survivors of one type, survivors from one country. We want to make sure that we're inviting survivors of different backgrounds of all kinds, different trafficking experiences, genders, etc. Equity is enabling equal participation by those who are newly invited. So making sure that although survivors are invited into certain conversations, that they can actually access those and participate equally. So by offering support and resources. So I've heard some examples throughout the conference as well. Whereas transformation, I suggest, is about changing the system that excluded people in the first place. One of the fundamental challenges of inclusion is that you are including people into a system that excluded them. And so we don't tend to think about actually transforming the whole system. What I want to present and argue today is that survivor leadership will enable transformation of the anti-trafficking sector and that it contributes to survivors' well-being. The latter half is where I'll present some of the findings from my PhD research, which I completed last year. So first, I want to convince you that transformation of the anti-trafficking sector is necessary so that we move from inclusion to transformation. So first, before I get into that, I want to highlight that the way I identify a survivor is a person with lived experience of human trafficking and who has exited exploitation. This is really important because we often conflate the terms victim and survivor, but the reason why I want to highlight that I use the term survivor is because we're talking about, when in this sector, we talk about identifying victims. And when we say identifying victims, we're talking about people who are currently being enslaved or trafficked. And so I'm talking about survivors who have exited the experience of being exploited. Survivors were once victimized, but it recognizes that someone's in a different status. We're not trying to help survivors exit exploitation. Survivors may need to be supported to remain out of trafficking, but it's a different relationship to the person by using the terminology survivor. I also know that survivor is not, we don't have a monopoly on this term. There's survivors of cancer, etc. But it recognizes that someone has overcome a trauma. Survivor leadership is the process and practices of using one's lived experience to benefit others. Someone doesn't have to be in a position of leadership. They don't have to have a certain title or a leadership role. They just need to decide to use their lived experience of human trafficking to benefit others. Because there are many survivors who decide not to be engaged in anti-trafficking work at all, and that's completely fine. An ally, for the sake of this conversation, is a person who has lived in continuous freedom. What I mean by continuous freedom is that you were born not into an enslaved or trafficking state, and you've stayed in that throughout your whole life. But not just that you actively work alongside survivors to transform the sector. So using those definitions, hopefully you can take those with you throughout this conversation and talk. So why do I believe transformation is necessary? Because the default lived experience in the anti-trafficking sector is from those who are not survivors of human trafficking. I say this because we often associate lived experience with survivors. Yes, survivors of human trafficking bring lived experience of human trafficking. Those of you in the room who've not experienced trafficking, I would say you bring the lived experience of continuous freedom. When we get into spaces like these, conferences, programs, policy discussions, we assume that there are no survivors in this room. We assume that that is the default, that survivors are outside of these spaces, and that fundamentally shows that this is a space that has implicitly excluded survivors, and in fact assumes that that's going to be the case. Now, that default means that the expertise, epistemologies, and ontologies, I would argue, of survivors are not being included in this space. That means that if we're thinking about understanding a social issue from many different perspectives and from all different angles, we have really excluded a huge body of literature, a huge body of knowledge by excluding survivors' expertise in the realm of research. And I believe in policy and practice as well. So I want to talk about transformation instead of inclusion, instead of diversity, and instead of equity. Also, for those of you in the UK, you may know that it's a horrible time for hay fever sufferers like myself, so I may have to just go on mute and have a sneezing bout at times, so forgive me. And I want to talk about equity in the current sector. Equity in general is something that, yes, to aspire to, but I'm talking about transformation is different from equity in the current system. So some of you may have seen this image. First, the artist is Angus Maguire, which is rarely referenced. So here, equality is giving everybody the same. Everybody here gets the same box to stand on to see the baseball game. Whereas equity is seen as, wait, well, the first person doesn't need a box to stand on, they can already see. The other two need different types of boxes to stand on in order to see, or different quantities. However, this in and of itself has also been problematized. So, from the Equality in Education Coalition, here is a quote. Imagine, if you will, 3 people, all the same size. The ground beneath them slopes down, buckling beneath one person so significantly that person cannot see over the fence at all. The foundation on which these people stand is unequal, and that foundation, might we even say systemic, difference leads to some being able to watch the baseball game while others cannot. So this still assumes, the equity and equality assumes that the ground that everyone's standing on is level. And these are people who are different sized. Adult, maybe middle, young person, and then a toddler. When we're talking about equity, it's all adults, but they are, in this situation, survivors in terms of access to the anti-trafficking sector are on a slope downwards. And so it is also, the person talks about, this blog references the idea that the pathology is not in the people. It's not that this person's short that's the problem, and therefore we need to help fix their problem that they're short. It's that the foundation, the ground, if we had this image where the ground is sloping, we need to fix the ground. And someone who's on a slope needs something different than somebody who's on, who can already see. It might not be boxes for all 3 people. It might be something totally different. So transformation, I suggest, in the anti-trafficking sector looks like allies playing the games that survivors want to play. That means maybe survivors don't want to watch baseball or be able to see that. People who are excluded might not want to enter into the existing system. We might want to invite you to our side of the fence, break down the fence, and invite you to what a game looks like for us. So survivors setting policy, research, and practice agendas, that the systemic reasons for prior exclusion are reviewed, understood, and broken down. So recognizing that historically people have been excluded, and that has, and how and why. How has it been set up such that exclusion was built into the system? Understand those so that they can be addressed and changed. By not looking at them, they will continue to be in the institutional practices, policies, and ways of working. You can hear this in terms of addressing transformation of academia, of decolonizing education, not just the curriculum, but the system itself. And transformation would also look like creating spaces for repairing harm that exclusion enabled. There is harm that has been created by survivors being excluded from the anti-trafficking sector. And just by merely inviting people to participate does not acknowledge the fact that those spaces have been hurtful, and it's not that easy to enter them after that harm has been created. So that's a brief introduction to how why transformation is needed, just by the fact that the current sector does not include survivors systemically, that it was designed to exclude, and that there's so much more that needs to happen in order to ensure that survivors' agendas are being pursued. So some examples would be survivors engaging in policy development, research, and practice, actually setting the questions. The Modern Slavery Policy and Evidence Center released a report earlier this year that shared some survivor-informed research questions. But how is it that we don't think about what are the key research questions most important to people who have lived through human trafficking and slavery. Survivor leadership can also enable this transformation by making sure that survivors are diversity, equity, inclusion consultants to reveal and transform the exclusionary systems. The people who have been excluded can tell you what are the barriers, how have they been excluded, and how has it been so challenging to be included in the sector. Also, transforming the anti-trafficking sector needs survivor leadership because survivors can inform the sector of the harm that is done and has been done and suggest what the remedies may be. That can be just a space to share how harmful it's been. That may be actual reparations. There may be other things, but part of enabling transformation is including survivors. So there's two parts of the argument I wanted to make today. So survivor leadership will enable transformation of the anti-trafficking sector, but also I want to talk about how survivor leadership can contribute to survivors' well-being. So this is my PhD research. I want to give a content warning. There will be some quotes that are from people with lived experience, and they reference suicidality and not too many specifics of trafficking, but please make sure to take care of yourself. Step out if you need for this next session. Okay, so my PhD thesis was entitled Well-Being in Our Own Words, Survivors of Slavery Defining Well-Being. So you've heard that I've been using the term our. I identify as a survivor scholar and one of the few survivors that are out that have pursued PhDs. And pursued PhDs specifically in anti-trafficking. So the methods of my PhD, it was a constructivist, qualitative, grounded theory study. I took a grounded theory approach, used semi-structured interviews in person. So I know everything's been online lately, but this was luckily, I finished my data collection right before lockdown happened. The population was anybody who self-identified as a survivor of human trafficking and modern slavery. This was because despite legal definitions, survivors identify based on their understanding of these different terms in the sector, or they've been identified by the system as a survivor of modern slavery through the NRM or other processes. They had to be over 18, living in the UK, and I recommended that they were at least 1 year post exiting trafficking, but they got to decide what if they were ready or not. So they got to see the questions in advance, and were very clear about being able to skip any question. Also because the questions were not about their trafficking experience, it was about how they understood well-being. And my analysis following grounded theory approach did line-by-line coding, constant comparative method, and really integrated inductive, deductive reasoning, but didn't apply a theoretical framework to it. So it was open coding, and part of it was bringing my own lived experience to the coding. And my own lived experience isn't just about my own trafficking experience, but my lived experience as a leader working with hundreds of survivors over the course of the last 12 years. So I'm happy to talk more about methods, but this is my findings. So in interviewing, I was able to interview 16 survivors over 11 hours of recordings. This is the definition of well-being that I came up with. So well-being for survivors of human trafficking is a relational process that enables and sustains practices for answering existential questions about meaning and purpose. The practices are activities and behaviors used to manage the impact of trauma, build a life worth living, and learn about freedom from slavery. So in more layman's terms, well-being is a process, not an outcome or destination. Currently, you might hear the term recovery often used as a process. There have been some survivors of mental health and mental health service users who problematize the definitions of recovery, that it's still quite clinical and focuses on mental illness rather than broader well-being. So for survivors that we talked about, that I interviewed, it was that well-being is a process. It's not something that you reach. It's not a state that you achieve. Well-being is in the doing. So again, because it's not a state that you achieve, that the process happens when you are doing things. And that the process is about answering the questions of meaning and purpose. That doesn't mean getting to an end with an answer, but there may be answers that to these questions of meaning and purpose that change. People may be existing in the fact that they don't have an answer, but they're pursuing the question. So well-being is this process to allow survivors to engage in these questions of meaning and purpose. And I'll go over that in a minute. The types of doing and the practices, excuse me, they focus on managing the impact of trauma, building a life worth living, and learning about freedom from slavery. And I'll go over these in more depth. So well-being is a process, not an outcome. Here's Harmony. She says, when you look at the scar, I look at how far I've come, how far I've come, and the fact that I'm still alive, I'm still getting stronger every day. So the how far I've come, there were many examples throughout all of my interviews of survivors referencing time, and that their well-being is a constant comparison of their process. Their survivors talked a lot about where I once was, where I am now, where I might be. There was also talking about the process, including being triggered psychologically, emotionally, that takes them back. So the idea of taking someone back in time showed that this process includes different experience of time, and that survivors are evolving during this process as well. That there wasn't one static understanding and experience of well-being. It's not today I'm well, tomorrow, therefore I will be well forever, but this a continuum of experiencing well-being. And then there's references to time in regards to lost time. The fact that some people may have lost their childhood, and yet they have to make up some of what we consider the developmental stages that one would have gotten in childhood. Or they missed years in adult life and they come out and see that others have progressed in their careers or education or whatever it is that might be culturally appropriate in that time, in that culture. Well-being is in the doing. So Akeisha here says, you wake up, you straight say, you can go to the kitchen and make breakfast, like you're ready to achieve something. Oh, I wanted to do this. You're out. You're getting out of the house, going for it. You're going for a goal. So a lot of participants would say well-being is when and then enter an action. And so it shows up in the doing. There's going to do something, there's going to school, there's keeping busy, there's exercising, so many practices. And then well-being is about the question of meaning and purpose. I separate these out even though other scholars link these two. Meaning I separate as why be alive, an explanation for merely existing. And purpose is what do I live for, a reason to continue living. And I really saw this differentiation in participants. So addressing questions of meaning. So here Adora says, I don't see the point that you brought me out and now you made me homeless. What's the point? And Brenda says, I don't know why I go to school. I think about killing myself. There's nothing. I have no family. So here they're really looking at a explanation for even being alive at all, period. And a lot of suicidality came up, participants, everyone had experienced suicidality at some point, either had attempted to take their life or even fight ongoing thoughts and experiences. And that was really important to recognize that that in and of itself was a ongoing question for somebody. Separate from this question of why be alive was the question of what to live for. So here Akeisha says, so moving forward, it's not easy moving forward because you're far away from your family. You're far away from your kids. But I want to be in a position to help them. Never give up no matter what happened, because if I choose to give up after everything that happened, then when they get older and they grow up, they will give up on things too. So that's why I never give up. I'm still pushing. So here Akeisha's purpose is to be an example for her kids, to show them something that she's been able to overcome something. So her reason to continue living is for her kids. This is what I saw, is that people can hold the duality of maybe I'm not sure why to live, my reason, my explanation for existence, there still lingers, well, why did I survive and not other people? But they can still create a purpose for their life. And they're interconnected, but separate. And then, as I mentioned, well-being is in the doing. So these practices, as I said, people would say well-being is when I enter a practice. There are over 91 practices, and I coded those and came out with these main themes. The practices are managing the impact of trauma, building a life worth living, and learning about freedom from slavery. So managing the impact of trauma is not just the psychological impact, although that is what most research focuses on in terms of deleterious effects, mental illness, illness diagnoses, some physical disabilities. But survivors really highlight managing the impact on their financial, spiritual, relational lives. So thinking about the impact beyond just the psychological, and that is a huge part of their daily lives. Another kind of lay person's example is seeing that their siblings were able to go to college, but they haven't been, and now their siblings are younger. And that is an impact of trauma, the fact that they couldn't continue their education. Practices of building a life worth living, so people would just try things out. Art, going to Survivor Alliance programs, other survivor engagement opportunities, sports, pursuing college if they could. Everyone was trying to find something that they could grasp onto, but that required actually actively doing the work to build it. That could mean, you know what, although I'm staying in asylum housing, but it's worth it to me that I want to make this look nice. And that's a life worth living because it's a space that I care about for myself. Learning about freedom from slavery also is unique in that current research does not talk about the adjustment period in terms of all the learning that one has to do about the implicit aspects of life. So whether or not someone was enslaved their entire life or lived in freedom, was enslaved, and then became free from slavery again, there's the experience of being trafficked and enslaved is a whole different world. Exiting that, someone may be able to refer back to their life before, but their life has been fundamentally changed. So how do I live now in this identity? How do I live now in a new country? How do I live now with new trauma or new mental health systems that I've never dealt with? So there's so much learning about life that takes so much of someone's life. So that could be also understanding new systems. How do I get the bus? How do I apply for housing? All these things that in wherever they used to live before, they may have known or they may not have needed to find out. Maybe somebody was in a wealthier family, so they never even thought they'd have to worry about income, and now managing their income and budget is a new thing. So that's not just I think it's important not to focus that on just general life skills that everyone needs to know, but it's particularly new life skills because of the fact that they went through this experience of trafficking and enslavement and had to exit. So I've talked now about the fact that I believe survivor leadership is necessary to transform the anti-trafficking sector, and that survivor leadership contributes to survivors' well-being. And maybe getting a note. So I'll look at the chat in a bit. So I want to say that survivor leadership itself is really comparable and fits into this definition of well-being. So survivor leadership is a process, not an outcome as well. Survivors are learning how to engage in anti-trafficking work. They're deciding who and what to say about their own experiences. Survivor leadership is about doing. It's not just in order to use your experience to help other people, you need to find how you're going to use it, even if it's talking to another survivor, participating in research studies, speaking to the Home Office, speaking to policy, speaking to NGOs, etc. So survivor leadership is in the doing. Survivor leadership also requires and supports people to manage the impact of trauma. If one is going to use their lived experience to be engaged, there is some level of being able to manage the impact of trauma that is required. So that's just managing mental health symptoms and or being able to wrestle with the fact that I may not benefit from the help that I'm giving somebody else, right? I may be suffering, but this isn't about my own needs. I'm thinking about supporting somebody else. So the impact in terms of what I've lost, I have to deal with that loss and not have that keep me from helping other people and preventing other people from having that loss. Survivor leadership also enables people to build a life worth living, because one way that people make purpose is to help others. Can't change the past, can't change what happened to me or other people, survivors can't change what happened to them, but they can change it for other people. And that gives them some purpose to turn lead into gold, to have this alchemy that enables somebody to make a difference with their experience. And then survivor leadership supports learning about freedom from slavery in a community of others by learning that I have a voice, I have important things to share, that I'm going to go talk to this NGO and I need to know what the heck an NGO is, that I'm going to inform policy and I need to learn this policy to give feedback on it. Those are things that are about learning from freedom from slavery. It could include how to use Zoom, how to show up to an interview, reading a consent form, taking the bus to an interview. All these different aspects of life can be learned by engaging in survivor leadership. And it's in a community of other survivors. At least at Survivor Alliance, it is in a community rather than isolated. Just checking my time. So hopefully I've given a bit of an overview and somewhat convincingly argued that survivor leadership can enable transformation of the anti-trafficking sector, because the current anti-trafficking sector is exclusionary, and just by survivors using their lived experience to inform anti-trafficking work, that will help transform the anti-trafficking sector. It's not just survivors telling their trauma narrative, but survivors informing the impact of the exclusion, how the exclusion occurred, that can help transform the sector. And again, as I mentioned, transforming the sector means being led by the agendas of survivors in research, policy, and practice. And then lastly, that survivor leadership contributes to survivors' well-being because, at least in reference to my definition of well-being, it contributes to key elements of well-being. It also contributes to other researchers' definitions of well-being. Well-being often talks about having positive relationships, positive emotion, confidence, self-esteem, subjective meaning of life. Those other existing well-being measures are seen within survivor leadership opportunities. And so at Survivor Alliance, in this work, I believe that survivor leadership can contribute to our sector becoming more survivor informed, simultaneously contributing to survivors moving with the trauma and living as best a life in freedom and pursuing freedom that we supposedly promise. So I will leave you with a quote. I won't leave. The ordinary response to trauma is to banish it from consciousness. Certain violations of the social compact are too terrible to utter aloud. This is the meaning of the word unspeakable. This is by Judith Lewis Herman in Trauma and Recovery. She wrote it in 1992, or there's an update in 92. Very much worth it. Survivors of human trafficking have gone through a trauma that is unspeakable, and yet we have decided that we want to speak. And sometimes, and a lot of times, it is not safe or comfortable to speak about the specifics of trauma. But what is more accessible is to speak about it by speaking specifically about how our lived experience of trafficking can inform policy and practice. There is work to be done to transform, I went through this, how can that help somebody? The mere telling of it may help me, may help somebody else, but also it can inform my ideas for how to improve systems. It can inform prevention, intervention, rehabilitation, all of those. And I think it's our job to make sure that we are not just including survivor voices, but transforming the system to actually center survivor voices. And I know that can sound scary in that it might seem like I'm saying allies' voices are not important. That's to the contrary. In order to center survivor voices, there needs to be true allies who want to put our voices and create opportunities for our voices to be heard. There will always be other agendas and other important work that needs to happen simultaneously. But when we're starting from a place of exclusion, there needs to be a concerted effort to make sure that survivor voices are included in meaningful ways, that we're shifting towards compensation, not tokenization, and that we are creating the space for survivors to sit in our seats as our peers rather than subjects and objects of study. And with that, I will stop and go to questions.
That was absolutely fantastic. I know we're over Zoom, but I hope everybody will join me for the applause emoji, since that is the best we can do right now. That was so wonderful. And while folks are collecting their thoughts, I was hoping to use my prerogative as chair to just bring up a couple of things that I just really resonated with me. First of all, I'm delighted at the tenor of the keynote, because this is precisely what we wanted to do with this conference as a whole, was to go beyond silos and to amplify the voices and methods that make what you have discussed, transformation in the human trafficking field, possible. And you had begun by asking us to reflect on our own experiences of exclusion. And I think there's these two sort of tendencies in this space that are perhaps polar opposites of one another. On the one hand, it's almost what I would maybe unfairly characterize as this hubristic tendency to feel like we as researchers have some claim to the experiences of survivors, and that we are owed for either the pursuit of knowledge or policy or whatever, and we are owed some sort of explanation and some sort of testimonial. And I think that's extremely harmful in its own way, precisely because, as you said, it tokenizes survivors and it commodifies them and reduces them to their experience of the unspeakable. And then on the completely opposite side of this, there's this hesitation that I would almost say is centered in some level of discomfort that we are being asked to bear witness to the unspeakable. And maybe that's a bit more sympathetic because perhaps you don't want to pretend that you can put yourself in the shoes of people who've gone through the unspeakable. But I think that in itself is kind of harmful because it does exclude and alienate people. And so the fact that you asked us to reflect on our own experience of exclusion, I wonder if you could speak more on that, and how, to what extent that relates to these sort of polar opposites that I've identified, to the extent that you believe these polar opposites exist.
Yeah, thanks for that question. Great question. So I asked you to do that so that you, I think, if you're in this sector, it's important to do anything that, in my perspective, anything that you can to empathize with survivors and put survivors on the same continuum as yourself if you are not a survivor yourself. I think there's this great poem by, I think it's Pat Parker, and she says, the first thing you need to know about me is that I'm a Black woman. The first thing you need to forget about me is I'm a Black woman. We need to be able to hold that survivors have unique experiences, and we're also the same, right? We're human. We all have uniquenesses, and we're all human. And so my attempt to have people think about exclusion is to think, well, then now what would you do? What would you want to be? How would you want to be included, right? And that if no one knows that you're being excluded, maybe you need to say it. Or are you thinking, oh, someone should notice that I'm being excluded? Now, I think survivors have long talked about being excluded, but it is important for survivors to have space to say, we are being excluded, and to be heard about that. The other thing I think is that bearing witness is finding the places in your story, your own story, that you can recognize might be similar. So survivors of any type of trauma, right? To get you closer to then thinking again about what would it be like if I had to talk to a researcher. If I'm a researcher and I'm going to ask survivors to tell their trauma narrative, oh, what would it be like if I told some stranger the worst thing that happened to me? So constantly putting yourself in survivor's shoes as best as you can. Now, I would argue that bearing witness is an important role in the sector, and different people have different capacities for it. I think there is a need at some level for all anti-trafficking researchers, professionals, to bear witness. That doesn't have to mean sitting and hearing someone's story. That can be reading a book, that can be other things, because what I've seen is that rehumanizes survivors. Sorry, that's that side. What was the other extreme?
There was the hubris side, and then there was like the almost over the oversensitivity side, where you're kind of afraid to put yourself in somebody else's shoes because you feel like you can't.
Yeah. Well, I guess they're kind of two sides of the same coin. I think definitely the hubris side of, well, they owe it to me. I mean, my answer is just no, they don't. No one owes you anything. But also recognizing that for you, this is a career. Most people. Whereas that's someone's life. And I think that is very hard to stomach. So I think someone asked me earlier, what is a barrier to survivor engagement? And I said ego, because asking survivors to talk to you about challenging experiences is contributing to your career. You will get a publication from it. Hopefully. They don't, right? And despite all of our best efforts, the impact from research isn't going, like I said, directly going to benefit most likely that interviewee, right? So being mindful of that.
Thank you very much. I'm going to just ask another question, and then I'll open it up to the chat as well. Um, Two things, just because I can't help but mention this part. I know there's, especially in the US, but I can see this around the world as well, there's this renewed desire to go beyond carceral approaches to either criminal rehabilitation or just in general, the rehabilitation of people who've been through traumatic experiences. And the pushback against the carceral system being that out of sight equals out of mind does not equal change or structural change or individual change. You can't put people in a position where they can't be perceived and then say, well, since you can't see them, everything is better now. And I would argue, and I know a lot of other scholars have argued, that often the conventional approach to human trafficking and survivors in general has been the carceral approach, where it's like, well, as long as they're integrated into society and no longer talking about their experiences, we've done it, we've fixed it. And so this is obviously an oversimplification of human experiences. We need to talk through things. Mediation is such a huge important part of getting past conflict between two people, let alone conflict within oneself, and then mediating the space between experience and research and policy. And so I wonder how much of this work focuses on visibilizing survivors and not just visibilizing them, but ensuring that they take an active part in other folks being able to sort of transcend their own experiences in a way that satisfies their well-being. But then how do we engage them in this transformative space without asking labor of them, additional labor that they may not be willing or even able to do, or beyond that, asking them to sacrifice their own well-being? And I'm sure your pedagogy, your organizational approach considers this, and I would love to hear more about that.
Sure, I think I can more directly address the latter part first. So I think it's important that we give people a choice, and we also talk about continuous and informed consent. I heard earlier methods using kind of digital methods, and I think it's important that we consider having consent forms read out, or people can hear it read to them in advance rather than sending consent forms. I mean, so many of us don't read privacy notices. And so how do we make sure that informed consent forms are actually, people are consenting for real? Because even though we try and simplify language on those about what the project is, so often people don't know. Survivor leaders need to absolutely choose to do this work, and therefore it isn't labor that they aren't choosing to do, but also if it's work, it needs to be paid. So we need to be considerate of people who don't have the right to work in certain countries, but we also need to figure out how to compensate people. And if we can't compensate monetarily, what are other ways that they are benefiting? So that is one of the key pieces, especially because we're talking about people who've been exploited for labor. So compensation is extra important, and that there are different types of compensation. So Survivor Alliance does work to help people understand what does it mean to work on a research advisory board versus consulting versus a full-time job. But the barrier to even getting those opportunities is still high. So we're seeking to cover that gap. But also I think in organizations, that gap can also be, whether in a research project or in NGOs, that gap can be bridged. So making sure that people learn the vocabulary of research, learn how to use technology, socialize them to this anti-trafficking world. Visibility, absolutely. I think by having more survivors be visible, I think part of that is decreasing the stigma. You know, people didn't used to say that they're a survivor of sexual assault or survivor of a divorce or cancer, right? More and more survivors coming out helps it make it so that it's not such a stigma to say that you're a survivor. It's just like, I survived, cancer. Carceral approaches. I think survivor leadership is potentially an alternative form to justice, because so many people cannot put their traffickers in place. Also, so many people have been so harmed that they're not going to want to have any reconciliation with perpetrators. They may, lots of perpetrators have had some connection to survivors, whether it's family or whatnot. Some don't, but I have not yet learned about successful reconciliation between perpetrators of this type of violence. We know about the Truth and Reconciliation in South Africa. That is somewhat different because it was from the state, at the state level. I argue there are some states that are participating in trafficking of human beings, but even if it's on a smaller interpersonal level, it's like, telling maybe, murder victims don't get to see their perpetrator because they're gone. And families of murder victims do talk to the perpetrator. But it is, I think, this is where lived experience is really important, because one thing I see is, again, put yourself in someone's shoes. For years, this person has exploited you physically, sexually, emotionally, some or all of the above. Do you want to face them and hear anything about what they have to say? Does an apology, what exactly is the result of that for somebody? And the labor it takes to be able to go to that and jeopardize their own well-being. I will say, what's important about survivors do have an emotional labor that is a burden, just like people of color have a burden when they're trying to educate white people of white supremacy. Any marginalized group has the burden of emotional labor. Some people still choose to take that on. That doesn't mean that we ignore the fact that that labor is taking place. So that's why when we compensate survivors, we include money for them to pay for extra counseling if they have a counselor, or we provide debriefs. So I'm co-hosting a research seminar next week, a workshop, and Survivor Alliance leads an hour debrief after the workshop with survivors only, to allow space to talk about anything that happened in that session, to also, I'm a trained social worker, help people find resources if they need it, but also to reground people and transition to something else in their life. So I think that we need to prepare for and plan to provide additional support. Just like, putting aside that I don't believe that trauma is a disability, and some people do have mental health disabilities. We make accommodations for people with wheelchairs. Accommodations for survivors of trauma doing this work is, I think, totally reasonable.
Thank you. That was incredibly helpful and really important. I want to move on to a couple of questions we got in the chat. I'm going to read out Carol Murphy's question first. Do you think that recent developments in the sector, such as BASNets, modern slavery and human trafficking, race equality, diversity and inclusion action plan will contribute to the transformation that you've discussed? And she's helpfully left a link in the chat as well.
Yeah, Carol, thanks. And I contributed to that. And I think it absolutely will contribute. I think one of the things that it does focus on is making sure that the sector is representative of the population being served. While that includes survivors, it also just includes like having people of color, whether or not you're a survivor, as caseworkers to other survivors, right? So I think it absolutely does. It still, I think the practicalities of being led by survivors in those spaces is the challenging part. We have a dearth of survivor leaders who are in the positions to lead that work, for example. And so I think it absolutely is a step, and they've made survivor inclusion a key part of that. And so I think that it is, among the better action plans that I've seen, and worth people getting on board with. And I think we need to think about how to how to include survivors in those plans in a way that enables what's the word I'm looking for? Continuity, because often the opportunities for inclusion are ad hoc, and we really lose the institutional knowledge from survivors from having been with the process the whole time. And so, if there's ways, to fund a position, for example, for several survivor leaders to be engaged in the process throughout the whole thing, I think that's really important. And therefore requiring upskilling and support for those survivor leaders to understand all the key players, etc.
Well,
Thanks.
thank you very much. I think Milena also had a question earlier, specifically about research methods informed by survivors. And I think this is another component of our conferences, underexplored methods. And sort of we've seen, especially today, the creativity that people can use in methodology in human trafficking research. And I think research methods informed by survivors is actually a really important component of that. So I don't know if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, I think certainly recruitment strategies, um, informing kind of existing methods in terms of what questions to ask on interview guides, um, and um, I, but kind of brand new research methods, not so much. I would say informing existing ones, and I think that's partly because research is not an area that is an easy jump for survivor leaders entering into this space. Um, I know that a colleague of mine, Dr. Juliana Rinaldi Simeoni, is not a survivor leader herself, but she used Q method, and it's seen more in the quantitative world, but it actually uses images. And I think anything that is allows different modalities, different learning styles is really important. I'm really interested to see more ethnographies, more survivors who are doing participant observations, but they themselves are observing rather than, I think we've done so much of positivists thinking there's this neutrality, and so having survivors actually observe is really important. So for me, it's putting survivors in those researchers' roles that will then allow for that adaptation. That's why in my thesis I very much highlighted, although some people think it's a limitation, I highlighted the strengths of the fact that I'm one of the few survivors bringing that lens to my analysis, and I would happily, with the consent of my participants, give somebody my data and see what they, both survivors and non-survivors, and see what categories and definition they came up with. So yeah, that's a not full answer.
No, that's so interesting though. Like a proper peer review process for data. I think that's really interesting, and also just sort of de-individualizing the data process and sort of more democratizing the idea of data collection. I know there's all sorts of intellectual property stuff associated with that, but
Yeah.
access to data is such a privilege. Like it's such a, and I think during the pandemic as researchers, we feel this acutely. And so data that can be democratized is helpful and then, weighed in on by people who are affected by the data and might have different approaches to it. Maya had a question that's very close to my heart, but it is 30 past. So
Happy to answer it. And I know you guys have a thing, so do you want me to answer it?
That's a very good question.
I'll put it in the chat. I'll sit here.
Yes, please.
Okay.
Yes, and just a reminder before I move on to the final phase and before we give Dr. Dang a wonderful round of applause again over Zoom, we will be leaving the networking room open after the conference has been closed. So if folks would like to continue the conversation, by all means. So once again, thank you so much for an incredible, insightful keynote. I learned a lot and I'm sure everybody else did as well. So thank you so much.
Very welcome.
And